Fleet has just recently completed a book that has been a labor of love for him for several years now, called Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Your Highest Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good. What a beautiful title that is. And Fleet, as a way to start, I thought I would just, you probably know who Jordan Peterson is. And he's a thought leader these days, and he talks a lot about responsibility as well. And there is a quote from him that I just thought would be a perfect way for us to kind of launch into this, and it could be coming straight out of the Buddha's mouth, actually. But he says that responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And what happens when you take an ultimate responsibility is that you will have an ultimately meaningful life. And if you have an ultimately meaningful life, then it doesn't matter if it is punctuated by suffering, or even if it is predicated by suffering. A responsible life is a life worth living. And for me, it's like it hit me right between the eyes. I don't know if he's a Buddhist, but it's a very Buddhist quote. And I thought it would be just a beautiful way to kind of maybe pass the ball to you and what is radical responsibility?
Yeah, well, that's a great quote, and I'm a Jordan Peterson fan. He can get a little strident sometimes with his positions, sure. but he's brilliant, and I think even a quote like that needs to be nuanced, because and when I talk about radical responsibility, I try to be quite clear about this. That quote and how we relate with our own suffering is very. I think it's really accurate and really helpful in terms of how we look at our own lives and whatever suffering we might experience in our life, which is inescapable to some degree. There's the inescapable suffering of being alive as a human being, and then there's the self-created suffering that we could do less of, right? But then on the collective side, saying that to other people that, your suffering is noble is not so helpful.
That's a very good point, actually. I think he was doing that because he's kind of pushing back against postmodernism.
I know what he's pushing back against, and I'm glad he is pushing back against it, and we'll go into that. But I just want to give a nod in their direction that would be the one thing they would always quote that, right?
Beautiful, because it's not either or, it's actually both.
And that's really the whole point of the radical responsibility. I really consider this a model that integrates personal and collective responsibility. That's awesome. This first book is more focused on the personal side, definitely, but I feel that's foundational. I don't feel you can do collective responsibility unless you embrace personal responsibility.
I love it.
I think there's a lot of, my fellow activists, and I've been, a social justice advocate and activist for the last 30 years or more. And coming through my college years was, way over on the left and anti everything and upset about everything and angry about everything. So that's my background. I've always considered myself a progressive on the left, although these days I'm struggling a little bit with some of my brethren on the left and where that's coming from. But I think part of the problem with trying to deal with collective responsibility and trying to create a more just world, trying to deal with a lot of the various kinds of injustices that still beset our world. If we do that from a place of non-personal responsibility, I think it just creates further confusion and further suffering, and it's not that helpful. Well, so I think the emphasis here.
Then it pushes the risk.
Yeah. Is what?
It pushes the risk. I was going to say because it pushes the responsibility on the other.
Yeah.
For making me suffer.
Absolutely. Right. And so what radical responsibility is, the way I describe it, is voluntarily embracing 100% responsibility or ownership for each and every circumstance we face day in and day out in our lives. And this is for us. This is not telling other people what to do. Now, I'm writing a book about it, so I'm suggesting that people might want to embrace this. But it's not to get this, what is necessary to realize is that this is completely beyond blame. It's a trans-blame model, right? It's stepping out of the blame and shame paradigm altogether. So, the circumstances we face in our life, we can look at those and very often see that we did have some role in creating them or allowing them or setting ourselves up for them in some way or another. And being willing to look at that and see that is not for the purpose of blaming ourselves. It's just with that insight and that information, we can then make different choices that are going to lead to different results that we will prefer and probably work out better for others as well. So how do we get that insight into what is my part in creating, my situation, and what's my part in creating my future, and really taking ownership for that. And then as well, there could be things that happen to us and others, obviously, that we just don't see we had anything to do with, right? We really feel it just fell out of the sky and landed on our head. And even then, can we own the choices that we're making in terms of how we respond to that situation, right? And the response, and I make it clear that people are terribly victimized in our world. And this whole conversation is about adults. It's not about children. Children need to be protected, and in different cultures they're brought into responsibility at different at times with different rites of passage, and our culture is pretty loosey-goosey and not so well done anymore. But at any rate, children need to be protected. But this is a conversation for adults, about adults, between adults. And as adults, still people are victimized in terrible ways. And so radical responsibility might just be that they choose to do what they need to do to get the validation they need, to get the support they need, to be seen for the fact that they were victimized, or to seek justice. But can you do that from a mindset of owning my own choices and owning that, how I move forward in my life is really going to be determined by my choices? And can we do that from that place rather than from a place of really constantly reinforcing a victim mindset in ourselves? And the problem with that, the victim mindset, which I describe very simply as anytime I'm attributing the causation of my internal state, how I'm feeling, to things outside myself. So we all do that all the time. I'm upset because somebody said this. I'm upset because the government's doing that. I'm upset because it's raining outside and I wanted to go for a picnic, whatever. And we perceive the outer world to be persecuting us in some way and causing us to feel unhappy. And it seems pretty compelling. Something happens and I have a feeling. But actually, there's a whole inner landscape going in there, which we can have ownership over. We perceive our needs. We all have basic human needs: food, warmth, shelter, connection, relationship, love, autonomy, self-agency, need for respect, validation, creative expression, all these things. When our needs are getting met, how do we feel? We feel good, right? We have all the warm and fuzzy emotions. When we perceive our needs are not getting met, or they're challenged or threatened in some way, then of course we have the more challenging emotions, right? So there's a whole landscape in there. And of course, our perceptions are not always accurate. In fact, at the very best, they're a limited read on a limited set of data, and full of assumptions. So, and that's not to demonize myself or that inner landscape. It's just the human condition. But can I be curious about what's going on, that I'm perceiving things this way, and then I'm having these feelings, and then can I take ownership over, okay, well, maybe this situation really is, uncomfortable. Maybe I have a boss who's kind of a tyrant, okay, and I'm just feeling victimized by that. It's all my boss's fault. Or can I say, this situation is difficult. What can I do? What can I do? Where is my agency here? Because once we ask that simple question, what can I do? We're back in the realm of possibility, and there's a million things we can do, rather than just continually giving away our power. Because, the fact, even though we all try, we cannot control other people. We spend a lot of energy trying to control our spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, children, parents, friends, coworkers. It's impossible. People are going to do what they do. And we all know that because we do what we do. We don't let other people control us. And so, focusing our energy on the one place where we really have some influence, and that's with ourselves, rather than continually giving our power away. So the idea of radical responsibility is not taking on a burden. It's not self-blame. It's just a choice to put my energy where it can do the most good, which is looking at what can I do to create the best possible situation for myself and others each moment and going forward.
Putting your energy the only place you can do the ultimate good.
It is the only place, right?
I mean, everything starts there, in other words.
That's where it starts, right?
And
then from that place, you can speak truth to power, and you can work for social justice, and you can do all these things. But it's very different when it's done from a place of personal ownership than purely a place of blame.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about giving away power and moving out of the blame paradigm, which is completely related to the issue of power. And in fact, when we are blaming, it's kind of, there's a mistaken view, a wrong view, or counterintuitive, that we actually think we have power by shifting the responsibility. And yes, maybe the other person is blameworthy. I mean, that might be a fact. But when I do that, I actually give my power away. And the only true power is actually the power to choose to be responsible for what's happening on my interior.
And
Like you
blaming
said,
and shaming other people doesn't lead them to change the way we would like them to change anyway.
right, exactly.
It just puts people on the defensive, and and it's natural that we do this. I want to make that clear because we've all been, none of us get through childhood unscathed. Even the most enlightened parents can't help but give us a basic inoculation of shame that all human beings get, that starts because they can't surround us with total unconditional love 24/7. No parents can do that.
Sure.
And when we're 2 years old, all it takes is our parents looking slightly irritated for a moment, and we feel rejected, and it's just, we all get that to one degree or another, and some of us get a lot of it. And we don't want to be blamed anymore. We've been blamed for lots of things. So when something comes up, we just very natural, and we all have this tender, vulnerable place. So it's just instinctual to want to shift blame. I remember I listened to a talk by my colleague and friend Joseph Goldstein one time, and I'm not calling him out here. He shared the story in a public talk, a retreat talk, and he said, he's talking about he was at some retreat and they're in the cafeteria and they're going through the cafeteria, with the trays, to get their meals. And somehow in the serving area, one of those big lids over like a chafing dish got knocked off and clashed to the ground. And he just goes, "It wasn't me." And he just saw himself have that reaction. And he goes, "What was that all about?" And of course we all do that, right? We all do that. And so we instinctually want to defend ourselves and want to shift blame somewhere else. The problem is, in doing so, we give away our power continually. Even if I think it's mostly when we're having difficult feelings, but even if I'm happy, and I think the reason I'm happy is because you're doing X, well, I'm still in a sense giving my power away, and we usually don't worry about it when we're happy, but that means if you stop doing X, I'm unhappy, right? So it's just really taking responsibility for managing our own internal world of our own physiology, our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors, and taking agency for that so that we can then contribute to the world as someone who's really standing on their own 2 feet and not only has a capacity to self-manage, but has a capacity to be open and giving to others, rather than being in this defensive posture of blaming and living from that place of blame.
Well, because you mentioned it's the first of 2 books, and this one's more about self-responsibility. So I'd like to ask you about practice, because radical responsibility by itself, to be radically responsible all times, all places, in all circumstances, is a huge practice in and of itself.
Yeah.
But if we do our Dharma practice, our sitting meditation practice, or whatever engaged Dharma that we might be doing, I remember my own first big insight about responsibility was when my teacher Pandita, basically, I went to the interview and I kind of complained. The guy next to me was breathing too loud for my practice, and he just said, "You do your practice, he does his practice. It's never, in terms of a yogi, it is never the other person's fault." And he said it in kind of not so nice of a way.
Right.
So, but that just got buried into my consciousness. And then once I accepted that, then I went about years of practicing trying to live up to that, because it's not easy to live up to. So maybe you could speak about it just in a bit of a...
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think Western Buddhism is being at the moment overtaken by the postmodernist view, which is very blame-centric and shame-centric, even though they feel they're saving the world and their focus is compassion, inclusivity, and diversity, and all the rest of which we all value, of course. But
Absolutely.
I think their approach to getting there is completely based on blame and shame and intimidation and thought control and all the rest of it. So, and that's really, I think, infecting Western Dharma in a big way, which is really interesting, because Dharma is really, people may not like to hear this, but Dharma is very much about kind of pulling, your own bootstraps kind of approach. And that's not to say it's imposing that on others. When you see somebody who's suffering, oh, you should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not what, it's us, if we're Dharma practitioners, embracing that view for ourselves, right? But it's like, to me, it's a demeaning view. It's like everybody wants to see everybody as a poor, non-resilient, oppressed, traumatized victim today. We have to structure everything,
disempowered victim.
Yeah, and it's very demeaning and disempowering, actually, in what Trungpa Rinpoche called idiot compassion, actually, in my view.
Yeah,
But let's bring
but
it
it's a
back to
very,
practice.
but it's a very subtle form of idiot compassion that we're only finding at the leading edge of our culture now. And I think
Yeah.
it takes a sophistication to see it and a sophistication to work with it. And radical responsibility is actually what it is needed to actually lean into that and try to understand where the line is.
Absolutely. It's probably the most sophisticated form of idiot compassion that we've seen. And
For sure.
it's driven by a lot of collective shaming, because if you don't agree with it, there's already a whole set of names for you, you know. And even questioning questioning that view, you're already creating harm, and you're already involved in microaggressions, and you're already, you know, all the rest of it, right?
And heaven forbid you're a white male,
And
which,
heaven forbid,
both
right?
of us
Right.
are, but
You can't question the view at all, or you're already, you know, diagnosed as being somebody with a problem, and not only a problem, but causing harm to others. So
yeah,
it's complete thought control.
yes,
And to me, anti-Dharma, really. But at any rate, coming back to practice, in
yeah,
order to step into the driver's seat of our own life, which is what this is really all about, um, we have to be present, and we have to be aware, and we have to be awake, and we have to be really willing to look inside ourselves and do our personal work and do that deep investigation, so we actually understand how this inner landscape works, right? And I think a basic meditation practice, mindfulness awareness practice, is critical. I also think it's important to do some psychological work. Not that we have to go into therapy, but at least to be psychologically informed, that we understand that we all have a lot of conditioning from our childhood, and it drives our lives unconsciously, and we're naive if we think it doesn't, no matter how long we've meditated. So we have to be willing to look at that stuff and understand what are those behavior patterns and what are those habitual patterns. And it's not like we have to go back and figure out where every one of them started, but we just have to recognize that they're there, and that we're constantly projecting all that stuff onto the world and then justifying it. And so we just have to have a little, you know, that kind of psychological insight about the fact that we're not walking around as autonomous adult human beings making free autonomous decisions all day. It would be wonderful if that was true, but actually we lead very mechanical lives where we're responding in a conditioned way, in a very reactive way, to things around us all the time. And even people with strong meditation practices, if they haven't done that psychological work of, you know, that's what I love about the integral model, is that
right,
we realize we have to work on all these different lines of development. And one of the lines of development is certainly doing that psychological work to get insight about our own conditioning, our own behavior patterns,
yeah,
and
right,
see that.
yeah,
So, but on the meditation side, one thing I emphasize a lot these days is taking a very embodied approach to mindfulness awareness meditation practice, or mindfulness practice. And of course, many people do. And I think it's very important. And I like to talk about it from the perspective of what we call interoceptive awareness, or interoception, which is the body's capacity to feel itself from the inside out, right? It's how we know when we're hungry or thirsty, or if we're experiencing muscle pain or a headache, or, you know, those are examples of interoception, but we normally don't have that awareness except when there's some discomfort.
yeah,
But if we focus our mindfulness practice to really get deep into the body and awaken that interoceptive awareness in an abiding way, we can have an abiding presence. There actually is an abiding aliveness and presence in our body that once we tap into, we can have a more consistent relationship with, and really live from that presence, which creates an internal resonance in the body, which is very nurturing and healing for ourselves personally. And we also know now, especially from you know, various areas of neuroscience and neuropsychology, but also this emerging field with Dan Siegel and others of interpersonal neurobiology,
yeah,
that ramping up our interoceptive awareness is also connected to our relational capacity and our ability to create
totally,
attunement with others, right? So
totally,
the more embodied and present I am within myself, others are going to experience me as more present, more available. But also literally, we know now things that are happening, and I'm not going to get into the specific neural pathways and so forth, or the brain anatomy, but we know that our capacity for internal attunement and external attunement are connected.
totally.
And
And interpersonal attunement.
yes, exactly.
You know,
Interpersonal attunement and interpersonal attunement, the two are connected and they reinforce each other.
well, it's interesting because, you know, I'm also an Aikido teacher for,
Mm-hmm.
for 35 years now. And this is my dojo here, and I'm teaching daily, almost daily. And it's always was interesting, something I discovered a long time ago. Any type of interoceptive blind spot that I have in my body. Maybe it's a shoulder trauma or whatever. I'm just not in touch with the certain areas of my body, the chakras, whatever. And they're not tuned in. I'm not in touch with them in myself. I cannot connect with them in another person. It's a blind spot for me and that other person.
Yeah,
A lot
absolutely.
of times when we kind of step energetically on each other's toes or invade spaces, it's simply because I'm not introspectively tuned in to what's going
Yeah,
on with me.
absolutely.
And when I do tune in, I suddenly have this is a bit more refined awareness, but then suddenly I have a refined awareness of what's happening introspectively with the other person.
Hmm.
It's an intuitive understanding, not necessarily psychic or.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm.
And what we tune into with interoceptive awareness is our whole internal physiological landscape of physical sensation and just the movement of energy in the body. And that is very much obviously connected to the brain and cognition. And it allows us to be aware of the whole process by which we get triggered into, whatever level of a fight or flight or stress response, and the whole emotional realm and the relationship between our emotions and our physiology and our thought processes and our behavior. Like, if we really want to have self-agency and be in the driver's seat of our life, we have to understand the connection between internal physical sensation, the operation of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, sympathetic branch, our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors. If we don't thoroughly understand that landscape, and if we're not awake to that landscape, we're not going to be in the driver's seat of our own life.
Yeah.
We're going to be living in the interface between our childhood conditioning, which we got before we had anything to say about it from our family legacy and the culture around us, and then the environment. And we're going to live in that interface. And depending on what we got as children, that may, we may be fairly high functioning adults that may work out okay, but it's not awake and it's not aware. It's purely
It's not
mechanical.
awake and aware, yeah. And no, that it's usually just perpetuating karma.
Absolutely.
Just moving from the past and perpetuating it. So this is what I was going to ask you. So okay, interoceptive awareness. Yeah, okay, we can do that. Why do I need radical responsibility? But now I think you're actually talking about the area why we do need to have we need to internalize through practice this radical responsibility.
Absolutely, because it's just helping us see, like, hopefully we're all responding to some longing to evolve ourselves, to respond to the call of our own lives, whatever that is, karmically for us, or just whatever it is, the call of our own life to evolve and grow and actualize our abilities, our talents, just actualize ourselves, right?
Yes.
And then we're also concerned about the world. We would all like to keep, contributing to a world that becomes more sustainable and have more equal opportunity for everyone, and just overall take better care of ourselves, everyone else in the planet. We would all like to do that. So to do that, we need to be high functioning, and we need to be clear, we need to be awake, and we need to be operating from a place of self-agency. And to do that, if we're sitting back and we're kind of in the dark about how all this works, and whenever whatever we're unhappy about is somebody else's fault, what are we going to be contributing to life, right? We're going to be contributing to our own suffering, and we're going to contributing more blame and shame to the environment. And, there have been, sometimes I take the example of my time in my incarcerated time during my years. I was incarcerated from 1985 to 1999 on drug charges, something I have a lot of deep regrets about the harm I caused in getting myself there. But I do feel good about what I did with my time there, because it completely woke me up. My son was 9 years old at the time. I was devastated at what I'd done to him. And I became really radically dedicated to use that time to completely transform myself and make a contribution. Fortunately, I had already a lot of background. I've been trained in meditation for 15 years. I had a master's degree in clinical psychotherapy. And so, which begs the question, why was I such a knucklehead to end up in prison? Suffice it to say, I was one of those people. But I did use the time well. And, in looking at how to create change in that, I was at a maximum security federal prison hospital. It's a total institution. Resistance is futile. If you buck the system, you're going to be in 4-point restraints back in the psych ward on a concrete bunk, getting hosed down at night and pumped full of Halidol or Thorazine, literally. So how do you get something done in that environment? And, if you can battle and spend your life, doing court cases, and I respect some of my fellow prisoners that did that. And in the 70s, there were court cases won that, that gave me some of the freedoms and rights I had in prison, actually, although most of them have been diminished over time by the courts. And that seesaws back and forth all the time. But I found that by, you know, taking ownership for the fact that I was there and I'd gotten myself there, and then that what I was going to be able to create and what I could contribute there was going to be about being in relationship with people and modeling things and operating from my own values, my own Buddhist values, and of compassion and empathy and kindness, and taking responsibility for myself, and living and operating as an adult, that I was actually able to create. I created 2 national organizations there and created all kinds of innovative programming in that place. And I did it from that place. And I saw other people, you know, constantly in this place of battling from the place of their unprocessed anger and the blaming and the shaming. And, you know, maybe a few battles get won that way, but I think in the end, you're just perpetuating the war.
Right.
You know, it's like, even with the left and right now, we have this idea in our country that people on both the left and right think if they get into power, then they should have their way. And we can stuff our agenda down the rest of the country for 4 years or 8 years and think that's winning. It's just the other side's just going to come back. You know, I mean, we have to find a way that we can all be in relationship. We'd rather be right than be in relationship, you know, and be right about our positions. And, you know, I'm right about social justice and the way things are happening. If 70% of the country doesn't agree with me, well, they should just go shoot them all or send them to another country, right? You know, it's like that's the way people think. And we have to move forward as a people and as a country and find ways, you know, common ground that we can move forward on. Because this idea that one side gets to shove their agenda down the rest of the country when they get in power, it doesn't work. And that's just creating more and more divisiveness. I'll make the argument all day long that the left elected Trump.
I agree. I completely agree.
By shoving, in this very triumphalist way, shoving their agenda down the rest of the country that wasn't ready for it.
Right.
And I agree with most of that agenda, but it doesn't mean you can shove it down people's throats.
Which was also a reaction for the Tea Party, and again, it's just a perpetuation of movements that
on both sides, you know. But I think there actually are a lot of people, reasonable people in the middle, who you can find common ground with, and who want us all to move forward in a reasonable way.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, the landscape's gotten so divisive, right? And it's like, it's just, and unfortunately, in my view, the Dharma in this country is really getting conflated with a pretty extreme leftist view. And in my own Dharma communities, I've been asking people, are you trying to create an environment here that only a small percentage of people from the extreme left will be comfortable coming in the door? I mean, did you say we don't want Republican meditators here, much less even just basic Democratic liberal meditators who don't agree with that agenda either? No, you have to be an extreme lefty, bought into that total agenda if you're going to meditate here. That's crazy. You know,
well, you know, and it's interesting too, because if you look at conservative, traditionally is all about self-responsibility. If I can just reduce it a little bit, forgive me for being reductionist. Whereas liberalism is about social justice, social care and concern. And
I think you have to, not even, I wouldn't even say liberalism. I would say more, because there is, you know, people make a distinction today between kind of classic liberalism, and then there's what I used to call myself a progressive, but that name has kind of been co-opted by, I'd say, the extreme left today.
Sure.
And that view is definitely totally focused on social justice, at least ostensibly, but it's all about causes and conditions. And that generally also has been the liberal view to a degree. I mean, there's an overlap that they want to focus on the causes and conditions of injustice, and the right wants to focus on personal responsibility. And
there you go. Yeah. So
both. It has to be both.
It has to be both. And that, I mean, and if we just kind of look at Buddhism for a second, because Buddhism is pretty much a conservative tradition. That, you know, it's why is it conservative? Because the transmission has been conservatively passed from generation to generation for the purpose of the ultimate freedom, liberation. So you right there, you have the yin and the yang of both. You have, you know, this kind of preserving, and yet for the purpose of liberation. And it doesn't, if you just preserve, then liberation gets squashed. There's no more liberation.
And the Dharma has been about and the Dharma has been about social transformation from the very beginning. I mean, the Buddha was undermining the caste system in his time. And, you know, and certainly it has become conservative and institutionalized in various countries at different times, especially in Asia. But overall, you know, but then the whole Asian socially engaged Buddhism movement arose to really bring Buddhism back to its contemplative roots and to focus again on the needs of the disenfranchised. So Buddhism has always had that element, but it is conservative and traditional in that it does take a stand for certain values and takes a stand for certain principles.
There are red
And,
lines
yeah.
around ethics, around morality. There are red lines, and you maybe a more progressive view of that would say, okay, you cross them, you're just going to create karma for yourself and others, and it's going to be you're going to harm yourself, you're harming others. It's your choice because you are an adult. You can be responsible. It's your choice to cross it or not, but just know that it's creating bad karma. It's actually not helpful for Dharma practice. So those lines, in a way, they by limiting ourselves, they actually give us more freedom. Rather than limit our freedom, they actually give us more freedom.
Absolutely. I mean, freedom comes through discipline. Freedom and joy both come through discipline.
Freedom and joy both come through discipline. That's beautiful. I love it.
I mean, it took me a long time to discover that because, you know, when I was growing up and, you know, my parents were fairly conservative, good people. I mean, we had our problems in our family, but they were basically good Midwestern people. And my father was this kind of very conservative thing. And I was just reacting. I mean, we just missed, right? And it was the, you know, the 60s and all the rest of it.
Sure.
So, you know, my idea of freedom at that point was just being able to do whatever the hell I wanted to do, whenever the hell I wanted to do it. And I was running, you know, the other direction from any kind of accountability or responsibility. And, you know, that's a prescription for slavery, not freedom. You know,
so it's radical freedom, radical individual freedom.
It's just a prescription for, you know, being slave to one's own impulses and reactivity, right?
Right. Yeah.
Genuine freedom comes from discipline.
So Fleet, so let's go back to radical responsibility then, because I think we both agree that we need both. And how do you discover what you just live life, and you go too far, you don't go far enough, you live life, you find the balance. With wisdom, that balance will come. So what is the role of radical responsibility in finding the balance between these opposites?
Well, for example, when I go into prisons and you know, I go into prisons all the time working with my fellow prisoners. And today I'm also working a lot with correctional officers and with law enforcement, public defender, judges. We're really working with the whole criminal justice system. I just led a intensive mindfulness retreat last weekend for 30 correctional officers in Oregon.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Next week I'll be up in province of Ontario, Canada, working with 240 correctional officers and probation and parole officers. And some of my fellow, you know, prison rights activists and even some prison volunteers, well, what are you doing? You know, blah, 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 blah.
Oh, no, are you serious?
This is but this is the work that's actually going to transform the system, right?
Absolutely, it's beautiful.
And, but at any rate, when I do go in and work with prisoners, right, I want them to get, I totally want them to get that I understand that most of them were programmed by the circumstances of their lives to end up in prison. Most of them come from hellish backgrounds. Most of them have been victimized their entire lives. That our criminal justice system is incredibly unjust. That either by default or design, it's incredibly racist, and African Americans are just grossly disproportionately affected by the way it's administered, as well as other people of color. And I want them to get all that, and I want them to realize that it breaks my heart that they're there. And that, you know, and they do get that because that's who I am, and that's actually how I feel. And at the same time, I also want them to get that their future in that prison and outside someday is absolutely determined by the choices they're making today. And so if they want to go out and change the injustice, well, you know, get yourself an education while you're in here, and then get out and go out and, you know, try to change the world. But sitting around, you know, just with your victim story and playing the con game and, you know, justifying it by how victimized and all the injustice, you're just going to stay here and you're going to keep coming back here forever. So, you know, yes, I get it. And yes, it breaks my heart that we still have these levels of injustice in the world. But quite frankly, the world is actually probably more just than it's ever been. And people on the left don't want to see that. But we've actually made a lot of progress. And I think people really need to study history to have a historical perspective.
Oh, for sure.
To understand, you know, we all crawled out of the swamp way back when, you know, evolution is a brutal process, and we've come a long way. But, you know, history, if you look at it, you see, you know, it's a brutal situation.
There's no better time than before right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And on all kinds of markers, right?
Exactly.
And,
right. And not that it's perfect.
But we want to keep working with it, but we don't need to indict ourselves or indict humanity. We can actually see that we are progressing. And so, you know, I want them to get that embracing radical responsibility is the ticket out for them. And it's the ticket to a new life and a different life, a life that, you know, whatever life they want. and they get it. They totally get it. They
That's awesome.
they really respond to this message.
That's
And
beautiful.
but I don't want them to think I'm coming in there just preaching this without being aware of all the injustices involved and all the suffering that got them in there in the first place. I totally want to be aware of that. And that's why the model I promote in the criminal justice system is transformative justice, which I feel goes even farther than restorative justice, which is already a good model, but tends to be just about the person repairing their relationship with society on society's terms. Depends on how different restorative justice programs are different. But transformative justice is interested not only in restoring and healing rather than punishing, which is great, but it's interesting, what are the causes and conditions that this situation arose out of for that person who is the so-called harm doer or whatever, some person that caused some harm, like what in their life brought them to that moment, and what's the healing that they need, and what's the empathy that they need for the suffering that their harmful behaviors arose out of. And then what are the social causes and conditions that keep producing more and more people in that situation that are committing those crimes or doing that harm. And if we're not interested both in the healing of that person, which means really listening to their pain and what the, because we all, any of us that are out creating harm on whatever level comes out of our own suffering and our own backgrounds.
And
Right?
bad
So
habits.
what's the healing they need?
Yeah.
And also then, how do we deal with the social causes and conditions that are producing people in that situation? If we're not interested in that, we can't say we're interested in crime prevention, right?
Beautiful.
So,
That's amazing.
So a lot of my friends on the left would be very happy that I want to focus on changing the social causes and conditions of oppression and injustice that keep putting people in that position. And I absolutely do. But I want to do it not from a place of blame or indicting humanity, but training us all to embrace personal responsibility, because that's how we're going to create a better world together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the whole idea of radical responsibility, that is the agent that will bring us through transformation and transformation, evolution, as we evolve to another place, another perspective. Then the way that we relate to those conditions completely changes, and we're less likely to fall into those bad ruts and grooves.
Yeah, I mean, take the example of someone. Let's say we have someone in a Dharma community, and they're very concerned about racism in the country, and they're concerned about sexual oppression and gender oppression, or they're very concerned about rights
Politics.
for the LGBTQ community and transgender rights and all the rest of it. And this is a big focus for young people these days. And they just feel, they feel really right about it. They know they're on the right side of history, and they have the right views, and they're supporting the right thing, and all wonderful. We all want rights for everyone. Just we all believe in this stuff. But then what's their tactic? Well, they want to go into the community and convince that all the white people in their Dharma community that they're a bunch of white supremacists, and they're perpetuating white supremacy.
That they're part of the problem.
And they're all a bunch of cretins, and they're all transphobic. And if they don't completely buy into this person's fairly unprocessed, unformed, but political ideology, then they're involved in harm. They're white supremacists. They're transphobic. They're all kinds of evil. Now, do you think, a very good strategy for winning over the hearts and minds of people to bring about transformation and get us all to move to a place that is going to be more honoring to everyone and more diverse and less racist? I don't think so. It just pisses people off and scares people and makes them feel bad about themselves. And, it's just like this constant indictment of humanity. Buddhism is based on Buddha nature. In Shambhala, we talk about basic goodness, right? So the belief that all beings have inherent goodness and inherent Buddha nature, but I don't see any of that on the left today, on the far right either. But it's like human beings. It's like this really based on this Calvinist Judeo-Christian view that I wouldn't say, it's not fair to say blanket Judeo-Christian, but really Calvinist Protestant view of the flawed nature of humanity. And that's what's driven all of our institutions. That we have this fear-based view of humanity, that absent some coercive force of shaming or incarceration or putting them in the blocks in the town square or some kind of public shaming, that human beings won't behave well and that they're dangerous. And therefore, if we have that belief, what kind of institutions do we create? We create fear-based institutions, fear-based government institutions, a fear-based criminal justice system, a punitive, retributive criminal justice system. And all of that. And what I feel my friends on the left don't get is they're participating in that. They're participating in that fear-based, shame-based view of humanity
Yeah.
and thinking we're going to somehow bludgeon human beings into agreeing with their political views, what they think are the right views, right?
Yeah,
And
and
right or not, that's just not the way to win people over.
no, and if you have any type of progressive values, then you can't argue with what they're saying. But the interesting thing is, if it's very subtle, but quite often it's acting on bad faith. In other words, if there was a correction in the system, then it wouldn't be enough. It's not enough to actually satisfy that, because it's kind
No,
of a virtue. It's a
yeah,
virtue posturing to kind of, to push back against what they see as
and
different.
really, to me, in terms of radical responsibility, what I see among people who want to take on the mantle of I'm a person who holds the correct views, and I have pure political correctness across every view, and I'm an ally for every oppressed person in the world. It's really a way that they then don't have to look at their own racism and their own peers and all the rest of it. Like, I don't have to, I'm unquestionable now. You can't question me because I've taken on this mantle of political purity, and I'm the ally. And they don't have to, the minute they take on that mantle, they don't have to do their work anymore. Of course, we all have racism in us. It's in the culture. And it's not just white people, it's everybody, people, and we all need to work on it. We all need to look at it. Anybody like grew up myself in the 50s and thinks they don't have racist programming, or at least prejudiced or biased or programming in their neurobiology is naive, right? But we can be aware of it and make sure we're not acting from it, and doing our best not to act from it, and not to perpetuate it, and to transform it and get it out of our system. But that takes work. It takes real interpersonal work and real personal ownership for our own neurobiology and our own conditioning, which we didn't choose to get, but we got it, right?
So this beautiful. I love the direction that this conversation is taking, because I didn't really think I didn't expect that we would actually have a conversation of kind of the social things that are happening that we see there. But I'm glad we did, because what's happening is, like you said, it's very subtle, it's very sophisticated, and it takes a certain level of subtlety and sophisticated conversation to actually get at that stuff. Because if you don't see it, if you can't get into it, then taking responsibility for it is kind of impossible. So here's my question for you. This current book, Radical Responsibility, was more about personal responsibility, if I'm not. Now, you said this is the first book. Is the next one going to be about social responsibility?
Yeah, I very much hope I can birth another book, and my intention is for it to be about a radically responsible approach to social change and social transformation.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I'll send you, and I invite everybody watching this to send you lots of good energy to get that one out too. I know putting out a book is it's quite.
Because we all have the same concerns. We're all wanting to have, and especially today. I mean, climate change. To me, that is the critical issue that should be in the forefront of all of our minds every day.
Totally.
And the way to solve that is going to be coming together, in my view, with radical responsibility, personal responsibility, and collective responsibility to find the solutions. It's not about demonizing one group of people and saying, well, I'm pure because I do this, and there's all those horrible people out there and the horrible oil and all the rest, and we're going to, no, it's like we have to come together as a human race and take responsibility to find our way forward together with this.
Absolutely.
We don't have time to be in this being right, feel good warfare, political battle about it for the next 30 years. We need to come together and find a way to come together and find the solutions, right?
And that's the thing, because we are in this together, especially with climate change.
Absolutely.
But the fact is, the solution, or the problems we're facing can't be solved, as Einstein said, at this level. And the fact is, we need each other to evolve to the next solution.
I mean, one thing that people I think are very naive about, I have been a very strong proponent. I would like to see lots of regulation. I mean, personally, I was a complete anti-capitalist when I was in my 20s, so I understand that. But actually, if you study world systems, there's no economic system that's brought more resources to more people ever in history. And it has lots of issues, and it needs a lot more regulation.
Absolutely.
But we have to understand that the problem, and what gets in the political battle a lot, about ways we can regulate the capitalism, both in terms of making it fair for people, getting the money out of politics, getting the casino on Wall Street under control, but also environmental controls. And so, the corporate world is not continuing to perpetuate environmental damage, all the ways to regulate it. The problem with that is that we have major players in the world who are not participating, so what American companies will say, and what the more of the right side of our political wing will often say, okay, you regulate the hell out of our companies. We can't compete with China. We can't compete with Russia because they're not going to do any regulation. And if they did, they won't play fair. They won't even abide by it. So you're hamstringing us and we're going to become uncompetitive and the American economy is going to go down the tubes. Well, the left would say, oh, it's a bunch of excuses, but no, it's actually true. So we have to come up with innovative international ways to move the world forward because, it's complex. In other words, it is a complex situation. And
it's incredibly more complex than our thinking is.
Exactly. Our thinking is way too simplistic, and we need much more innovative thought. And it's got to come out of a place of personal responsibility, not blame. Personal and collective responsibility, because blaming always leads to simplistic ideas, right? Very simplistic, one-sided, being right ideas, feel good concepts. But those are not going to solve. These are complex human problems and complex global problems. And we have to come together and find innovative solutions.
Beautiful. Well, Fleet, we're kind of coming to an end. I also want to respect your time, but maybe I'll give you the last word here. If you, I'll say a word or two about your website and your book and stuff that's coming out. But would you like to is there something you want to leave us with in final words in terms of radical responsibility and what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I guess, we kind of where we did focus on some of the social side, I just want to make it really clear. Radical responsibility has nothing to do with blaming victims, right? It's about, for each of us, looking inside ourselves and where is my self-agency in my own life? And I personally believe, and it's been my experience, the more I live from that way, the more helpful I can be to people who are in, for whatever reason, a power under situation or been highly traumatized or in a debilitated circumstances. People who are, I do a lot of work and been a lot out in the world of homelessness, and I work in prisons, and I've done all kinds of training in Rwanda with genocide survivors, and I go to Auschwitz every year. I work in a lot of areas with people who've experienced a lot of trauma and people who are under terrible power under situations. And I find that the more I can model this idea of radical responsibility, not imposing it on us, but modeling it, I find ways to get in relationship with people that are actually, I think, helpful to them and empowering to them rather than being demeaning to them and disempowering to them and reinforcing their sense of, when I was in Rwanda, a lot of people are like, well, you can't take this model there. You can't talk about radical responsibility. You can't talk about Cartman's drama triangle with genocide survivors and blah, 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 blah. They loved it because they don't want to be victims. They are very concerned that the world know that and still hears about what happened there, because there's all kinds of genocide deniers out there in the West. And they want people to know this genocide really happened in 1994. And it was a genocide against the Tutsi people and the horror of it. And people want to know the truth, but they don't want to be victims. They want to be survivors. They have tremendous strength and dignity. And they love this model because they found it very empowering to themselves. And they don't want people coming over and treating them like poor victims and helpless power under people that can't stand up for themselves. That's not what they want. They find that very demeaning, right? So,
yeah, beautiful.
I just want to make it clear that it's not about blaming victims. It's about lifting ourselves up and helping to lift each other up. And if nothing else, just by getting awake to how this works. If we're asleep about how this whole, our whole neurobiology and psychology and inner landscape of conditioning works, then we're just going to live our life in mechanical reactivity. That's just a fact.
Yeah, beautiful. Fleet, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. Radical responsibility. It's like planted. I mean, it's always been for years it's been a thing of mine, but I love that you've been talking about it. I love that you've been teaching it for a while, and I love that your book is finally out, and congratulations on that. If people watching, if you want to know more about Fleet, there'll be a bio above or below this video, wherever you're watching it, and some links there. But also you can find Fleet at you can find more about Fleet at his website, fleetmaull.com, FLEETMAULL.com. And his new book, Radical Responsibility, is going to be launched on May 14th, and you can find out about that at www.radicalresponsibilitybook.com. embodied.com. Definitely go there. I'll put the link in the show notes and on the YouTube channel or whatever. And also, Fleet, I think he's offering Fleet's been teaching an online course called Radical Responsibility for some time now. And he's offering he has a special offer for those who pre-order the book. You can do that on Fleet's web, on the radicalresponsibilitybook.com website. If you pre-order the book, you'll also get access to Fleet's online self-paced course that was based on a live 8-week course called Radical Responsibility. That offer is between May 3rd, should be today that this was launched, this video was launched. May 3rd and May 13th, you'll get free access to that, and that's a $397 value just by pre-ordering the book. So it's kind of a win-win all around. You can't really beat that. Go to the site above, radicalresponsibilitybook.com, to take advantage of that offer. Fleet?
Thank you very much, Miles.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing radical responsibility into our Dharma discussion, and may radical responsibility impact us so we can have a greater impact in the world.
Well, thank you very much for your work, and I look forward to more online summits from you. And I wish I could come over and train in Aikido with you. I may be a little too old to get started with Aikido, but it's definitely the one I would have chosen if I was younger.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, I suspect we'll have another opportunity to meet up somewhere, somehow in the future. I appreciate the contact.
Great. Thank you, Miles.
Yeah, thank you, Fleet.
Bye-bye.